but it was the sacrifice that allowed them to win this championship. And I just think it's, again, an incredible testament to Staley, to her flexibility, to her ability to connect with her players. And also just, again, X's and O's. The defensive game plan for Clark was really solid. And I don't think the fact that she kind of lit them up in the first quarter was that not going to plan. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of The Late Sub. Honestly, we're just going to jump right in because there is too much to talk about. As you can probably tell, different background today. I am in Ohio, where I was just at the women's Final Four in Cleveland. I'm actually camped out in Columbus right now because I'm going to be going to the U.S. Women's National Team game on Tuesday night. But wow. What a weekend. Definitely worth it to be there in person. If I'm rambling a little bit today, if my voice sounds a little bit like I'm losing it, it's hard to describe the loudness of the environment that I was in over the weekend, whether it was the Final Four games, whether it was even just being outside of the arena in Cleveland, whether it was being in the arena in Cleveland, especially when Iowa was playing. It was a lot of fighting to be heard. I know people, the joke that like Cleveland rocks. Let me tell you, Cleveland was rocking this weekend. What a blast. Over 18,000 people attended all three of the games, the two Final Four games and the national championship. It was completely sold out in Cleveland. There were just by my personal estimate, I think it was a sellout, but by my personal just sort of visual estimate, I think at least 12,000 people came to open practice on Saturday. Hotel lobbies were full of fans chatting with each other. You're seeing fans of all ages. On Friday, I was staying in a hotel with South Carolina fans and Iowa fans, and they were like, chatting a little bit like, oh, hope I see you on Sunday. And they definitely surely did. You had people asking, what team you were rooting for, but also there was just this feeling of everyone was just really excited to be part of this moment in women's basketball. I think everyone kind of had a team that they wanted to win. I think that that's the beauty of watching a national championship, but I think so many people were also just excited to take part in what feels like a watershed moment. Well, we've hit a lot of watershed moments in women's sports over the last, let's say, 5 years, but this is a new high watermark. I mean, we've seen the TV ratings. I think as we record this, I think the TV ratings are going to be coming out soon. Caitlin Clark's games, game after game after game. More and more people are watching. They're breaking records on ESPN. Their Final Four game against UConn was the most watched college basketball game on ESPN networks ever. Truly incredible environment. What a win for women's sports regardless. But as we know, in sports, there can only be one winner. And would you be surprised? Congratulations to the undefeated South Carolina Gamecocks. They took down Iowa in the NCAA final to complete the first undefeated season in Division I women's basketball since 2016. This is Dawn Staley's third national championship after replacing her entire starting lineup. There's a lot to unpack here. I feel very lucky to have gotten to see these last two games for South Carolina because there was a feeling of closing a chapter that actually was still open from last year. I think when we were talking about South Carolina throughout this season, it was an obvious talking point that they had to replace their entire starting five because those players graduated. But I don't think what I didn't realize until coming and seeing this all in person is just how much this team carried those seniors with them through this year. I think I underestimated that. I think there was so much talk of the freshness of this new group or the transfers that came in, or the fact that they had freshmen stepping up, and Dawn Staley kind of joking about how it went from like a PhD program to daycare. But the thing that they had with them this weekend that I think provided that edge necessary to complete the task was falling short last year in the Final Four. Dawn Staley broke down in tears after the game. They spoke deeply in the press conference after the game about how this was for the freshies, that senior class that left after last season. Aaliyah Boston was there working for ESPN, and she and Dawn shed tears together. It sounded like Dawn Staley held a lot, or maybe was just slightly haunted by not being able to finish the job last year with a group that she considered to be one of the most talented groups she had ever coached at South Carolina. And to have this whole new environment in the locker room, to have this different group of South Carolina players come in and complete the task. They did not lose a single game. I think that brought a lot of closure to last year to this program. And that did kind of give them that edge. And obviously, Iowa was the team that beat them last year in the Final Four. We saw Raven Johnson talk about that at the end of this game. But let's talk about the game a little bit itself. Let's get into sort of how South Carolina won this game. I think it's just kind of an obvious thing to say that the poise of the freshmen and the sophomores for South Carolina was incredible. Tessa Johnson, who is a true freshman for the Gamecocks, she was the leading scorer for South Carolina on the night. You just saw every player kind of doing their part. Camila Cardoso dominated the offensive and the defensive boards. That was huge. Second chance points were incredible for South Carolina in this game. The bench points that they were able to provide, it was 37-0 was the ratio of bench points for South Carolina versus Iowa. They did have to weather a storm a little bit. Caitlin Clark came out really hot. She scored 18 points in just the first quarter, which I believe was the most anyone has ever scored in one quarter in an NCAA final. But the way that South Carolina dealt with that was at the beginning of this game, and we talked about the LSU game, right? The LSU game in the Elite Eight and how LSU had this game plan that they never really differed from, and Clark made them pay. What South Carolina did is understanding the different looks that they have as a team and some of the length that they also have as a team. They did switches on Clark. They switched a bunch of different defenders on her. It depended on kind of the possession and where people were moving, but they did a lot of switches. So Clark was looking at a different defender a lot of the time in that first quarter and a little bit of the second quarter. But what that allowed South Carolina to do is figure out what adjustments needed to be made to make it work. Like you're seeing Caitlin Clark shoot a 3 over Camila Cardoso and you're thinking, okay, we can't be pulling our big out. We need to keep her in the paint. What's the next thing we can do? And what they landed on was Raven Johnson. Now this is, again, kind of a full circle moment. And I love that Johnson was honest about it. She had talked throughout this entire postseason. In that game last year, the Final Four loss that South Carolina had to Iowa, there was that viral moment of Caitlin Clark kind of waving Johnson off as she went to take a 3. And Johnson said that fired her up. You know, it was something that the attention on that moment was very difficult for her. And instead of letting that impact her negatively, it only just made her work harder, and it made her relish the opportunity to set things, she's kind of just saying, like, kind of set things right this year. And Raven Johnson shut Caitlin Clark down completely. Clark was able to get her shots, and that was something that Staley said after the game. You know, Caitlin Clark's always going to get her points, but you just have to make it difficult for her, and you need to cut off the lanes to her teammates. And they also did an incredible job of answering at the other end. So I think what we saw from South Carolina in the defensive was a fluidity and an ability to rely on the depth that they do have to combat an Iowa team that is a little bit more consistent in the way that they play. And so kind of looking at the big picture here, looking at South Carolina, the undefeated South Carolina team, I'm just kind of fascinated by what Dawn Staley has built. And I think this is the perfect example of how, through great change to a program, like perhaps losing your starting 5, your coach learns new things about themselves and how to connect with a new group of players and how to maintain the intensity and the discipline that South Carolina is known for, while also meeting these players where they're at. And I think Staley showcased her ability to do that incredibly, and her players responded. I think we talked either last week or 2 weeks ago about Malaysia Fulwiley working on her defense over the course of the season. Staley spoke very eloquently after this game about how she's asked for her players to sacrifice in order to create an unbeatable team. 9 players for South Carolina got at least 13 minutes in this game. When that happens, that does mean that some players are going to be they're not playing 40 minutes, right? They're not playing 30, 40 minutes. Like a player like Caitlin Clark, incredible player, but she's given the opportunity to be out on the floor for most of the game in order to be able to build up those individual accolades, to score, to assist, to get the conversation going about her, because she has the time to do so. A player like Malaysia Fulwiley comes in as a highly touted recruit and fully buys into coming off of the bench and playing less than 15 minutes a game. And Staley had 9 players willing to do that, to be efficient. The plus minuses on South Carolina on Sunday were incredible. And they were willing to in an era where sometimes the personal brand can kind of feel like everything to these players, and they're looking for playing time and they're looking for that conversation. They're like, people didn't talk about South Carolina's players the way that they talked about Caitlin Clark because there was no individual carrying that team. But that's also what led them to the big one. I think that's what Staley said. She said, a player like Malaysia Fulwiley might want different things next year. She might want a little bit more playing time. She might want some of that national attention that you get when you're given the opportunity to play a lot of minutes, score points, make assists, show people what you can do. But it was the sacrifice that allowed them to win this championship. And I just think it's, again, an incredible testament to Staley, to her flexibility, to her ability to connect with her players. And also just, again, X's and O's. The defensive game plan for Clark was really solid. And I don't think the fact that she kind of lit them up in the first quarter was that not going to plan. It was more, we're going to test this out. We're going to be flexible and we're going to adapt. And that landed on Raven Johnson, and Johnson had an incredible game. I also want to shout out, this was something that Lisa Bluter said after the game as well. And I also noticed this, which is that talking about defensive game plan for Iowa did actually force South Carolina into a lot of kind of mid-range like floaters or mid-range jump shots. And South Carolina's players just made them every time. So you did have Cardoso being dominant in the paint, but sometimes Iowa would be playing the exact right scheme, exact right defense. They would force one of the guards into a pull-up jumper, but South Carolina made them. It's kind of like Caitlin Clark versus LSU. You dare them to beat you with the shot that you're willing to give them, and they did it. They beat them. So I was just so impressed by what the Gamecocks pulled off this year. They're going to be just as good next year. I think they do lose Camila Cardoso to the WNBA draft, but they have very talented players also coming in. They have Joyce Edwards coming in, who is going to, I don't think people realize necessarily just how good they're going to be next year. And like I said, I felt very lucky to get to witness this full circle moment for them that I didn't realize this was being carried in their hearts so much. And so it just goes to show how Staley's been able to. She was asked when she left her press conference, she was so generous with her time. She kind of answered a couple sort of shouted out questions as she left because she needed to go. And the last question that was asked to her was Dawn, is this a dynasty? And she just turned and she said, not yet. So they're going to keep going. I think there's a lot of humility to the program. They have really high expectations for themselves, but it's always internal instead of external. And regardless, it's just so interesting that we're having this conversation about the rise of the parity in women's basketball. And I think I talked about this before the NCAA tournament started, which is these good programs are also continuing to get better. And the way that Dawn Staley has kind of built this modern, let's call it maybe a dynasty. I mean, look at the Final Four, it's fourth straight Final Four, 2 championships in the last 2 years. It's remarkable what she's been able to do. And I just don't think it's going to stop anytime soon. But now let's turn to Iowa, because Iowa also had a very dramatic weekend, I think. It's not always the most interesting to talk about, why a team lost the last game of the season, because there's going to be so much change. It's not so much that they're going to learn from this in the future. But I will say, again, it was nice to be in the room with Iowa's players after this game as well, because I think they were obviously very disappointed. There were tears shed. They were so close for the second time. I think it must be a very surreal feeling to reach the top of the mountain twice in 2 years and not be able to reach the top, especially when you know that this is probably your last opportunity to do so. But I think they had a good attitude about it, which is that I think you saw the leadership from Caitlin Clark. You saw the leadership from Kate Martin. I think they were just sad that the season was over and that their college careers at Iowa were over. And even immediately in the aftermath of that loss, which I think they were very clear going into the game, just how difficult it would be to defeat South Carolina. I think maybe they play this game 10 times and South Carolina wins 8 or 9 of those games. So with that understanding, I think they were able to just go and enjoy the moment. And like I said, it was like an Iowa home game. The cheers every time they scored, that run that they went on in the first quarter. And I think that's what they're going to take away from this year and the last 4 years. Kate Martin talked about this. Caitlin Clark talked about it a little bit too, of just no matter what happens next, for maybe a player like Kate Martin, who is not a Caitlin Clark and is not going to be the number 1 draft pick in the WNBA, they will always be able to say that they were part of this moment and they helped drive this new interest in women's college basketball. And they talk about wanting to be remembered for the way that they interacted with fans and wanting to be remembered by the way that they brought people into this sport that they love so much. They're really proud of that. And I was impressed with their ability, even in the immediate aftermath of a national championship loss, to have that perspective. And I think that also just goes to show what leadership they had in the locker room this year. So Clark finishes her college career. She's smashed multiple NCAA scoring records. She's made 2 Final Four appearances, scoring the most points in the NCAA tournament. She holds the assist record in the Big Ten. There are some accolades I'm probably forgetting about, right? Like, the list goes on. But she doesn't leave college with a ring, which I personally think is fine. Or, I mean, it just kind of is what it is, right? I mean, there's always going to be a debate about whether Clark is like the greatest college basketball player of all time. I think we should welcome that. I think that there's a lot of different schools of thought on that I think are good. I think when Breanna Stewart, flexes the 4 rings in 4 years, she should do that. I think when someone like Caitlin Clark says, but look at what I did at a homegrown program, I think she should be proud of that. I actually think Clark doing something that was unique at Iowa is part of what drew people to her. I do think part of the popularity of Clark and of that program is not just, the logo threes, but I do think it's the fact that it was a unique story to people who maybe hadn't been following basketball closely. And so she should be proud of just the unique accomplishment that she pulled off in her 4 years. And I also just kind of like that she's now got bigger fish to fry in the WNBA. I think I'm people who listen to this podcast probably have a sense of this. Like, I'm ready for pro Caitlin Clark. I'm ready for pro Aaliyah Edwards, Cameron Brink, Camila Cardoso. I'm ready for these players, or Kia Jackson. I'm ready for them to move on to a bigger and better stage. And I think it's incredibly compelling to have Clark come into the WNBA, where she's kind of starting at the bottom of the ladder again, still chasing that first ring, at least at this high level. I think that's great. I think that's a huge storyline going into this year and the years beyond. So as a storyteller, I like it. I feel for Clark. I think that obviously she would have wanted to go out on a win, but I think they had a good sense of perspective. And I am excited to see the story continue, because she still has more to go. She still has higher to climb. And to that point about South Carolina, I loved seeing them be able to close that chapter as well. And also Iowa just kind of had an interesting weekend. I would be remiss not to mention the semifinal against UConn, though now it feels kind of a couple days ago. But UConn, I think, showcased again the game plan that South Carolina was able to scout, which was, they had Nika Mule on Clark, and Mule played very, very well. Talk about a player that I think draft stock went up considerably in the later rounds of the NCAA tournament. Played really good defense, though Clark did kind of get separation later in the game as UConn began to get tired. They did not have a high player rotation. And to be fair to Iowa, they didn't have a huge player rotation against South Carolina either. The 0 bench points, my one piece of defense for Iowa in the 0 bench points is they had to start a number of players in that game that otherwise might have been coming off the bench if not for injuries. It didn't really end up being Caitlin Clark versus Paige Beckers in that UConn game. Beckers had a little bit of a quiet game. I think she is still figuring out how to kind of grab a game by the horns and take over. I think part of that is also, though, just, Ariema's teaching. They're a little bit less of a green light team, or at least in this current iteration of the team. The game fundamentally came down to a moving screen call against Aaliyah Edwards in the last 9 seconds of the game. One of the things I loved about it was the debate that it caused. People were talking about that. People were like at the championship game talking about the call against Aaliyah Edwards at the end of that game. And I love that people are having that conversation. My 2 cents on it, though, again, I'm a little bit late. I do think it was a moving screen, and I also think it's super lame that game was decided by that call. I think 2 things can be true at once. But again, just a good arc for UConn, too, what they're building for next year. Because I think now at this point, the confetti has fallen. History has been made. We're seeing some icons of college basketball walk away, such as the nature of college sports, which I think is one of the reasons why people love it so much, is they can't stay. Players can't stay. They have to go. They have to move on. So what's going to happen next? Early, way too early prediction. South Carolina is going to be just as good next year. Apologies to the rest of the NCAA. UConn is going to be really good next year. They just signed the top recruit, Sarah Strong. She's going to go to UConn. If they get AZ Fudd back, that's going to be a good team. Losing Edwards is a big blow, but I think that this team, if they can help stay healthy, which I know we've said for a number of years, but if they can be healthy, UConn is going to come to play. USC is going to have something to say next year, too. They've got the number 1 recruiting class coming in to help Juju Watkins. And I think Notre Dame is also going to be a huge contender. You're going to see continued growth from Hannah Hidalgo, and I think hopefully they're going to have a healthier lineup. So I think there's going to be some obvious teams who did well this year who are poised to do well next year, which I think is a credit to just how talented this young class has been. I think Texas maybe is another really good example. And for everybody else, who knows? We're seeing some change, right? Angel Reese has declared for the WNBA draft, and Haley Van Lith has entered the transfer portal. LSU is going to look real different next year. Fascinated to see what happens with them. Kentucky is building something interesting. They just hired Virginia Tech head coach Kenny Brooks, who immediately had 2 players enter the transfer portal to join him from Virginia Tech, including Georgia Amore, who is going to be definitely a top prospect next year. And so I think we're going to see some of these shifting tides. We're going to see some of the perennial contenders, South Carolina, UConn. I think USC again is growing. And we're also going to see a lot of flux surrounding those teams, which I think is incredible. I can't wait. We just finished the season, and I can't wait for the next one. So what's next for us? What's next for the Late Sub is next week we're going to get into the WNBA draft. We're going to talk about where all of these players are landing in the pro game as we get ready for the WNBA season, which is going to be really cool. We're seeing Caitlin Clark's going to go on tour, but it might be a tough one because there's going to be a lot of players excited to get a shot at a big name. So can't wait to see it. But loved this college basketball season. What a great season to dive into. So many great stories. And it was South Carolina at the beginning. It was South Carolina at the end. Okay, moving on to the world of soccer. No time to waste. If you did not have enough women's sports on Friday and Sunday, guess what? Had you covered on Saturday. The SheBelieves Cup, the first round, took place on Saturday, and the U.S. are going to the final after defeating Japan 2-1, where they will play Canada, who advanced past Brazil on penalty kicks after a 1-1 draw. These games, I mean, probably if you're a fan that follows the team, these kind of feel like an ongoing part of that Gold Cup experience. A lot, obviously Canada is a team that the U.S. just played. It's a similar group to the Gold Cup. This is sort of a broad strokes look because I think this is all still just sort of putting together scouting tape for Emma Hayes when she comes to join the team in June. So let's just talk about the big picture things that happened in this game. And I think there were a lot of positives, actually. I think that this game was really productive for the U.S. And I think that's exciting because we've seen a number of productive games for the team over the course of this year so far, which is what you want when you're kind of on this short runway to a new-ish group going to an Olympics. So first, I mean, the big headline is that Jaden Shaw is very good. She scores again. She scores an equalizer after the U.S. gives a goal in the very first minute. It's kind of this audacious golazo from distance. I joked on Twitter. I was like, Jaden Shaw plays soccer like she's the only one who has the thought that maybe they should kick it into the goal. And I think that kind of ability to take those shots and be confident enough to take those shots is really, really important to this U.S. team that sometimes can get in its own head in the attack. She played in the midfield on Saturday because they moved Mallory Swanson back into the left wing, a fantastic return for Swanson, who also just looks really fit and ready to go. Very exciting. But I think that I've always actually kind of felt this way, which is that even when Shaw is brought onto the field as a left winger, she is encouraged to drift centrally. And so I think this is more now she's set centrally and encouraged to drift left. She played really well with Swanson on that left side, both of their natural movements. I mean, if you've seen Mallory Swanson play before, you know that she really prefers on the dribble to cut in. She loves to drift defenders on the top of the box to try to create separation. Shaw is kind of doing the opposite thing where she is placed centrally and she's able to drift out wide to receive service. Those two looked like a really natural fit. And she's the only U.S. player in history to score in her first 5 starts with the senior team. Just an incredible start for Jaden Shaw. Now, they do need to be careful with her. I'm not necessarily advocating for her to play 90 minutes every single game. She's a young player. Twyla Kilgore kind of underlined that in her availability today on Monday, that they're not going to rush it. They know how good she is. They know how efficient she is. She is, I mean, unless something unfortunate happens, hopefully not, I do think that she has to be in serious consideration for this Olympic roster. I don't know how you can keep Jaden Shaw home, but they are going to be methodical. I mean, I think we've seen this with injury returns as well. They were very methodical with Kat Macario with her minutes on Saturday. They're not going to try to run Shaw into the ground, hopefully, because that's a thing that the U.S. has struggled with in the past. But they know how good she is. That's basically what Kilgore said. And she unlocks things for this team that not everyone can unlock. And I'll be interested to see if she starts on Tuesday. Again, I think they're just going to be pretty cautious with making sure they're not overloading her. She's bringing something to the U.S. that we did not see in the World Cup last year. And it's hard to tell. Hindsight is 2020. Maybe she was ready for this last year. Maybe this is now the time. But there's a good argument that she right now is one of their most valuable players, and she's only just reached that senior level. I would also want to point out that the U.S., I think the mentality element was great. Again, they give up a goal in the first minute, which we'll get to in a second, kind of why that happened, because there was a structural thing that occurred that allowed that goal to happen. But because it was in that first minute, they kind of didn't panic. It was sort of so wild that Japan got that goal so early that they didn't really they didn't know if they needed to adjust. They basically were like, well, we didn't really get to implement our game plan because this game just started. So let's just keep implementing it and see what happens. And they didn't get shook. They did not back down. They were very aggressive in their attacking formation. They held a very high defensive line. They got the outside backs involved in the attack. And that allowed them to work their way back into this game. That response, again, maybe just more in a mental piece. It is that audacity for Shaw to take a long distance goal like that. But we also saw Swanson come very close to getting a goal herself. She had a couple moments in front of Japan's goal that just didn't quite land as she's sort of getting her finishing back. And then after Shaw's goal, they keep kind of on the front foot. They keep pushing. I think the penalty that Lindsey Horan scores in the second half was indicative of the U.S. kind of wearing Japan down. It wasn't always the sharp, again, it's that push-pull. It wasn't always the sharpest in possession, and they did have moments where they gave up space. And like I said, I'll talk about that in a second. But it's still just what they have learned from this Gold Cup in terms of mentality with a group that feels like a veteran group at this point. It's hard to overstate just how important that's going to be, especially with the understanding that they're not going to have a ton of time with Hayes before they go to the Olympics. So a lot of positives. I think you're looking at the young players making an impact. You're looking at Mallory Swanson's return, looking fantastic, looking like she's ready to walk right back onto this team. You're talking about the mental element of coming back from a goal down to win 2-1 and kind of having that confidence almost, not a flurry of activity to chase something that didn't need to be chased in the second minute of the game, but just to implement the game plan and say, yeah, we're going to keep playing the way that we were going to, and we think we're going to beat you straight up. It worked great. That's the U.S. that we like seeing. That's the U.S. that fans like seeing, even if they don't always get the result. But that feels more like the U.S. of old from the mentality element. But that Japan goal it didn't come out of nothing. It wasn't a fluke. It came from Japan overloading the wings because they correctly scouted and identified that the U.S. likes to play with very attacking outside backs. Jenna Neiswanger was playing on the left side. She's pushed up forward. And Japan, to their credit, they are, I would say, a little bit more versatile in some of their passing patterns than maybe the Japan teams of the past. They're willing to go long. They're willing to go direct if they see that space inside. Now, it's possible that the U.S. says, that's fine. We're happy to give up space on the wings. We trust our center backs. We trust our recovery runs. It's more important for us to remain aggressive, retain that aggressive mentality, and we will deal with that defensively when it comes in. Maybe they say that, but that was an issue at the beginning of this game, which is that they play this high line, and sometimes you get burnt from a really nice goal on the wings. I don't know if this particular approach would work well against a team like Japan, or a team, well, they were missing. I felt like Japan was also, unfortunately missing June Endo, who is out with an ACL tear. She is such a good wide player for them. But I think Japan quickly identified that they were going to get space on the wings. They understood that Neiswanger is going to be really important in the attack. So they basically surpassed the wings and got their shots from outside. But like I said, that worked. There was that same approach that allowed the U.S., when they were looking for a goal, to keep pushing forward and to get that breakthrough. I still also, just on the other side, still feel like Emily Fox is doing a lot of cutting in to assist the defensive midfield, which it plugs one hole and creates another. I still don't think that the U.S. is particularly comfortable in a single defensive midfielder structure. I think that a lot of times they do have help coming in from the wings, whether it's from your wingers having to come back, or it's your outside backs having to cut in. And there is exploitable space there still. And Japan wasn't able to execute. And again, to the US's credit for putting them on their heels a little bit and making sure that the line of contention was high enough that Japan wasn't always able to get comfortable pushing into the US's attacking third. But they still haven't solved that. I think that we are still looking at a team going into maybe June games, July games, and the Olympics without that midfield structure completely figured out. Now, I do like that they're trying it. I like that they're being aggressive. But we also saw that with Vlatko Ananovsky's US, which was that ultimately they decided they needed to go to the double pivot because the exploitable space was being exploited and it was hurting them in the back. So interesting tape, I think, from the United States on this one. Like I said, a lot of positives, but also some question marks still ongoing. And we're not really seeing, we're seeing the team really commit to Sam Coffey, which I think is great. I think Sam Coffey has a lot of really valuable things she brings to a midfield, particularly in ball distribution and aiding the attack. I think her positioning requires some help from teammates, which perhaps is something that the U.S. is willing to give up in order to have those other things that she can do as part of their arsenal. But I also am questioning perhaps why we're not seeing more different looks from different players come in to play that number 6 role. Because I think Sam Coffey is an incredible option. But I think, for the U.S. that wants to kind of vaunt that depth, I think that they should be looking at other options as well. But all in all, I think good stuff from the United States. This was the game that I think they really wanted. I mean, this is why they scheduled it first. They really wanted to play Japan. That was a team they hadn't played in a while. Very, very good team who did quite well at the World Cup. Kudos to them for winning at home. I think they did a very nice job. Naomi Girma did have to leave the match with a thigh strain, which you never want to see, obviously, but hopefully that's not going to hold her up long term. But also, I guess, a good kind of heartening situation to see Abby Dahlkemper come in, and the defense didn't really feel like they were derailed too much. I think that's a positive for Dahlkemper, who had kind of an up and down Gold Cup. I think we always talk about how Girma is indispensable for the United States defense, and that is true, and that is why I'm very, very happy that this will hopefully not be a long-term issue. But the fact that in this moment, they had to make that switch and they were able to do so, I think is a good sign for the United States defensive depth. And also, again, I think a testament to Tierna Davidson, who has continued to look really, really steady for both club and country in 2024, which is exactly what this team needs. Like I said, they'll be playing Canada on Tuesday in Columbus, Ohio. I will be there. I think this is just giving them an opportunity to actually play a soccer game versus the semifinal of the Gold Cup, which was really kind of taken over by the weather conditions. It was that really wet, sloppy game that I think both teams walked away not feeling like they really got to implement any philosophical ideas on the pitch because they didn't have the ability to do so because of the conditions. So in a way, this is nice. I think that there's more things to learn from a rematch against Canada than maybe you might think, especially because their last meeting was not really on good. It was on equal footing, but equally bad footing. So I'm interested to see how they approach this against Canada. Would love to see Lily Johannes brought in maybe for a little bit of playing time, though I'm not sure Canada is the exact right opponent for that, just because of the way that they like to impose physicality in the midfield. But more rotations, get a different look at different these midfielders, because I think the midfield is really in flux, especially with Shaw moving in there. You think, okay, what does this structure look like that allows for attacking freedom, but also a sturdiness that can't be exploited by other teams? So really interested to see what happens there. But yeah, a bright start to the SheBelieves Cup for the United States. They have to feel good about what they're kind of cooking up here. I think the biggest question is, how do you hone it into something that can continue to impose a style of play to control games with a final group, which we are getting closer and closer to seeing that. So this has been this week's edition of The Late Sub. Like I said, we will have more United States Women's National Team games to talk about next week. We will have NWSL games to talk about next week. We will have a WNBA intrigue to talk about as that kicks off with the WNBA draft, which is going to be really fascinating to see how these teams stack up. Lots of really, really good stuff. And I just have to, again, reiterate how much fun I had covering this year's basketball season in college, and hopefully more to come in the future.